Howdy, Cassandra. This is my presentation. I'm going to be talking about David Smith and whenever he phoenixed, he rose sculpture out of the dead, not the war times. David Smith grew up in the early 19th century, right whenever World War One and World War Two, and I'm going to be talking about how he reimagined steel and kind of brought up what and changed the idea of this wartime medium of metal could be. When speaking of World War II, most people's minds just jump to the genocide of the Jewish race and countless other humans that were lost. But it's not just that. The Nazis took 3% of the world's population and a lot of the world's antiquity. he, Hitler really didn't like art that wasn't strictly European. He didn't like any of the new Western forms, and whenever he was on his rampage around the world, he was stealing art, destroying it, and he was just kind of creating this idea that there needed to be a supreme order over the cultures. And because of this, and before that too, there was a lot of repression against I'm living in this time of war. Who am I? What am I doing? So this new expression of Dadaism came into form around the same time as World War One, and Dadaism is pretty much just talking about using the nonsensical form of art, the randomness, the unheard of, the parts. It's making sense out of the nonsensical, something that Hitler totally would have hated. He did hate it, and Dada was just really important in that sense. And Dada was a turning point for sculpture. Before Dadaism, sculpture's primary form of all aspects decided were forms and have been done over and over again. But the first time the Impressionists. The Impressionists, everyone hated them whenever they came into the scene, but after they were remarked as the best, and now they're everywhere in the museums. And the first time that the Dadaism was in a museum or a gallery was the Fountain by Duchamp. Duchamp is one of the most important artists of the 19th century. He created the Fountain and many other important pieces of work, but completely changing the landscape of what art can be. By putting the Fountain upside down, it wasn't just him though, it was his female friend that actually created the Fountain, but he decided to put it inside a gallery and changing if I put this random object inside of a gallery, is it going to be art? What can be art? Who am I in this type of world, and what am I going to create? Who is me, and what is the art that I'm putting out into the world? Okay. And then, the Dadaism, and then this uncertainty, unpredictableness, it all came around. And then it was all because of the war. And then David Smith, he grew up between all of this. He saw it all happening. He grew up through the wars. He knows all the history of the wars. He was an avid reader. He's a clear example of one of the victims of the wars. And his father was a technician. His mother was a teacher. His father would often take apart random objects. He would have David Smith take apart random phones. Not phones, but random little machines and put them back together. This idea of taking things apart and using the mundane and then putting it back into something totally new is going to come back into David Smith's lives later on. He grew up in Ohio, surrounded by the rural landscape. He was fond of nature and beauty, and was in the industrial elements that are placed upon untouched nature. He attended Ohio University and the University of Notre Dame, but attended his studies to become an automobile welder in Indiana. He abandoned his studies. David Smith did not exactly know what he was yearning for at these art schools. He wasn't getting what he wanted to learn at these art schools. He still wanted to be an industrial worker. And when he was an industrial worker, he was making war machines and cars, all these industrial heavy machine objects that are kind of dangerous whenever you really think about it. He loved the work of the American people, and he wanted to create work that was for the people, not this untouchable idea. I mean, Dadaism is really important, and he knew that, but it's kind of untouchable to the everyday man or everyday woman, everyday person, that it's kind of hard to read. During the 1930s, David Smith embarked on an artistic journey to explore Europe, and he saw Cubism, Surrealism, Constructionism, and this is whenever he came upon Pablo Picasso and Julio Gonzalez's approach to sculpture work. What they did, them two together, they created this new idea of called drawing in space, which the previous sculpture would have to rely on one entity like this cup. This cup is one entity. It's just one thing. There's a hole in it, of course, right here, but imagine if this wasn't here. You get the point. It's one entity, but what they were trying to do is create drawings. So instead of one thing like that, it's this spoon connected to this, connected to that, connected to this, and you're creating a drawing, a composition in space that's where it makes the whole piece circumnavigate, and you have to walk all around, and you have to see every point of it to really understand what's happening. And this new idea really changed sculpture completely. A lot of people say that Pablo Picasso was the one, but it was really Julio Gonzalez. Pablo Picasso made this idea of sculpture famous, but they worked together, and it was originally Julio Gonzalez's idea. Okay. We need to look at the workplace of the industrial, where these metals are coming from. 1935,000 people died in a factory each year. 500,000 were injured. That's a lot of hurt. With all this deaf iron began to leave a bad taste in the public's eye, viewing it as destructive and dangerous and intoxicating. It wasn't really a medium, it was an art form, and it was destructive, and a lot of the art at the time of steel and iron was destructive art, and it was a very tactile and dangerous, and it looked very dangerous. David Smith comes back, he goes to New York City, he meets his wife, but whenever he's in the school, he goes to the Art Students League, and he meets a whole bunch of people, really, really important people of the abstract expressionist movement. Let's see. He was part of the group of the Irascibles. All of them went to the school. The Irascibles consisted of Smith's peers and friends who he traded with, like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Lee Krasner, William de Kooning, George O'Keeffe, Robert Motherwell. They were most notable. And what's quite interesting about that is that they're all on the top floor of Munson. If you go check that out, they're all hanging out like they did whenever they were working together in New York. So he was working there, making part-time. He was in the small corner of this facility, making his sculptures, doing small sculptures, getting the scraps from the welders, he was in a welding studio, but wasn't welding. He was in the corner. And he would take the scraps from the random people, pick it up, he put it on the ground, he'd kick it around, he'd kick it, and he'd kick it, and it would create this automatic, surrealist idea of creating art, where you're not in control of it, and it's really leaving it up to your body, the random movement of your body to create this art piece. He was really fond of that. So, whenever we kind of look at his first pieces, he was starting to get into this idea of painting onto sculpture. It was an idea, but it wasn't really. It was done before of Greek antiquity, and it was found out later on that all the Greek sculptures were painted on, but it wasn't really done at the time. I mean, sometimes some of David Smith's sculptures even got painted over because people thought it was supposed to be white, even though he didn't do that. And then we fast forward to his bronze medals, which he depicted. They're called Medals of Dishonor, 1937 through the 1940. It was a bold new step, as he was usually preferred to work outside the traditional realm of art. But he really decided to hone in on this classical Renaissance way of making art, and it was a low relief sculpture of the effects that war has had on him and the war has had on the world. So David Smith, he did good. He started to gain some recognition. He started to become a really reputable artist, and he moved out of New York City with his wife at the time to Bolton Landing. Bolton Landing is by the Adirondacks in upstate New York, and this is whenever he started to put steel in a new light. He really wanted to rebrand it all. he loved still. He worked for it. It was his lifeline. He really loved working with metal and making things for people, for the people. But he didn't like this connotation that it had of the war and how it's dangerous. And he sought to really rebrand it all. So he was thinking of how he could do that, and he began to paint. One of the first people ever to start painting on these steel compositions of the scraps. It was a real juxtaposition of this sharp object with the wait guys. It was a real juxtaposition of having the sharp object with the paint. By 1940, but he moved out. He became good, and then by the time he was living there, his wife broke up with him. He went through a lot of heartache in his life, and he started to make these giant sculptures, these circles of these unifying sculptures, these circles that would embody. It was a lot like Kenneth Nolan. He gained a lot of inspiration from in the 1960s. It's just a circle, and you rely on the palette and what this shape provokes in you. And he had all the circles lined up together, and he wanted them together to look through. You can see this palette of the changing colors. He really thought he was with the painters. He always described himself as a painter, not a sculptor. He didn't like being put into one little box. And eventually he was, right whenever he died, he died on a fatal crash on his way back from Robert Motherwell. He was visiting him and he was drunk and he crashed. But he was creating these figures, like these tall figures of people, these figures of things that derived from an emotion or an entity that he was longing for. And he placed them all around his house and all around his farm. And he was, it was kind of encapsulating of this new idea of Greek antiquity, of these totems, of what sculpture can be, of what a totem, like a new age totem. And he was one of the first people ever to do that, but sadly he passed away. But a good takeaway, and one most important takeaway to take away from all this, is that he was the one who really rebranded steel, and not making it not such a mean, sharp object, but he made it into something beautiful, which is really gorgeous. And because of the World War's long-lasting effect on David Smith's generation, he became the forerunner to rebrand everything that sought to destroy the world. The early 19th century, and especially the 1960s, was truly a time when David Smith phoenixed sculpture from the ashes of war. All right, I hope you like my talk, and I love David Smith. I hope you like him too, and I hope you're having fun in Greece, and have a good day.